In 1982, American actress Linda Hunt won an Academy Award for playing Billy Kwan, a Chinese-Australian dwarf man. What director came up with this somewhat bizarre casting choice? It was none other than hero of this channel, Peter Weir, a director of great wisdom and empathy, who has made nuanced and mature films across a huge variety of subjects and genres. Could this be the exception? The Year of Living Dangerously is set in Indonesia in 1965. It's a romance, though, starring Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver. Perhaps most alarmingly, it's from the 1980s. Now, there were some good movies from the 1980s, but actually there weren't. Of course, this is not a Hollywood movie. It's an Australian film, one of the most ambitious films of the Australian New Wave. On the surface, this movie seems like it could be a little bit of a mess. Is there such a thing as a bad Peter Weir film, and could this be one? Well, let's start with this casting. These days, people are often uneasy about actors crossing racial lines. But there was a time when this was actually a mark of prestige, when white actors playing non-white characters was marketed as an exciting challenge of some sort. Marlon Brando did this many times in his career, and it was seen as prestigious. It was marketed as, wow, look at this great acting. Look at him do what he's never done before, something like that. Peter Sellers did something similar for comedic effect. Linda Hunt is a white actress born in New Jersey. Not only did she play a character that's half Chinese, but also a character that's a man. In some ways, this might just be the 1980s take on what Brando and Sellers were doing. In some ways, it's a stunt. And it's one that came off well at the time, with Hunt winning an Academy Award and Billy Kwan carrying the film, becoming an iconic character for a lot of people. Billy is a blockbuster role, a linchpin of the film. It's one of these roles that's kind of written for an Academy Award, you think. In interviews, Peter Weir said that he was taking a big risk by casting Hunt, but that without trying something different, there was no way he could capture what was such a vivid character. This is an adaptation of a book. Billy Kwan, such an interesting character in the book, he felt perhaps like only by taking a risk could he translate that to the film, like the film would sag if he didn't try something new. And I guess there probably weren't too many real Chinese-Australian dwarfs lining up to play this part. Linda Hunt has had a long and interesting career. This film was towards the beginning of it. If you feel like you need to blame somebody, probably blame Peter Weir, not her. By all accounts, Hunt was very uncertain about the scheme. Now, I'm really just here to report the news. It's up to you if this casting is an alarming anachronism or no big deal. Of course, you might also hate Mel Gibson, given his remarkable track record of very poor choices. Personally, I'm not a fan at all of whitewashing or yellow face. One of Hollywood's many unfortunate legacies, part of an existential conundrum for a lot of classic films, and something that has had real cost to real people and still does. Hollywood still does this from time to time for some reason. At the same time, the movie came out 40 years ago. By watching it today, you're not making a deposit into Peter Weir's bank account. You're not endorsing a particular view, I don't think. Even by reviewing the film, I don't think I'm endorsing a particular viewpoint, and I'm not worried that by watching it, my own morals might be eroded or my reputation might be eroded. I do understand, though, if it completely sours the movie for some people, or if it's a distraction at the very least. For me, it was a distraction. This is compounded somewhat by the fact that I actually don't think Linda Hunt is very good in this movie. Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver are fantastic. And compared to them, Linda Hunt doesn't seem like anything special. And furthermore, this character of Billy Kwan, which is supposed to be this blockbuster role, the linchpin of the movie, it actually didn't do it for me. I don't know exactly if this is the casting, the acting, the writing, or a bit of all three. I think it's probably a bit of all three. But Billy Kwan was not a strength of the movie when I watched it. The film is actually narrated by Billy Kwan. Some of the narration is good, but a lot of it is overkill, I think. Like I said, this film is from a book. That's often the case when you find narration in the film that it was taken from the book, and it just seemed so great that they had to include it. But the book actually has a different narrator. I haven't read the book. I don't know. Maybe they still took some of the lines across. But maybe Peter Weir is behind Billy's lines, and they are a bit heavy-handed. Billy Kwan is intended as an enigmatic character, but maybe they take this a little bit too far. For me, it was hard to latch on to the character, and a bit hard to latch on to the beginning of the film in general. The film starts out with Mel Gibson playing Guy Hamilton, an Australian reporter, showing up in Jakarta. This is potentially his big break as a reporter, and he's got his tape recorder that will come to have some symbolic value later on. He's confident, but doesn't really know what he should be doing, where to start. His predecessor was supposed to meet him there and show him the ropes, but in fact went home, got out of Asia. Instead, Guy's introduction to the country comes from Billy Kwan. Billy Kwan sees him very favorably. They begin a friendship rather quickly. It's not exactly clear why, though. I don't think Linda Hunt necessarily does a bad job, but it's safe to say that the spark that an audience would have felt in 1982 from this interesting choice, from this risk, is gone now. And maybe this is what Peter Weir predicted, that without that, the film is a little bit less vivid and the movie sags a little bit. Not a glaring mess, but things did feel a little bit off. And there were definitely scenes without Billy when I was glad to be rid of him. On the other hand, Sigourney Weaver and Mel Gibson are great. That said, they do seem to be the only two normal people in the movie. Guy Hamilton bonds with Billy not because he is incredibly nice or principled, but because he isn't mean. He just seems a bit normal. I think they get the balance right here because both characters are endearing, nuanced, and dynamic, but they might be slightly lacking in defining traits. In some ways, they're kind of just foils for everyone else in the film. Most of the other characters are extreme, like Billy. Turns out that there were a lot of interesting people in Indonesia in 1965. Guy shows up and heads to the International Hotel, where he meets a bunch of other reporters, where he meets a bunch of minor dignitaries. It's a bizarre ensemble and a stark contrast to the world on the streets. This strangeness might be another reason why the early parts of the film are a bit hard to latch onto, but I think it's probably by design. Disconnection is an early theme of the movie. The reporters are here to find out the story on the ground, to see what things are really like, but they spend most of their time shuffling between the hotel and the palace. They go to the bar, where there's American music being played, American dancing. There's a curfew, which is kind of bizarre, that cuts short some of these activities. It's a strange place to be. In some ways, this movie reminds me a little bit of MASH, the TV show, the movie, and the book, where all these characters, disjoint characters, extreme characters, are brought together a long way from home by geopolitical forces. They're friends at the end of the world to some extent. Very deep connections, but also very tenuous connections. People who maybe won't see each other except in these strange circumstances. You might expect reporters to be deeply engaged with the everyday happenings on the ground, with the locals. I mean, who goes all the way to Indonesia to report on things without caring about the conflict and the people? Well, it turns out that most of them are professionals, reporters, and dignitaries that have been in many different places, have seen many different conflicts, and that have perhaps gone numb. They are a bit nihilistic, but what's the alternative? To feel too much, to actually confront the suffering and the issues going on. Instead, they spend their hours getting drunk in the International Hotel or loitering around the palace, like I said, American music, looking for an angle that they can phone back to their newspaper, something that's interesting. But like I said, there's a disconnect. This angle never really seems to represent exactly what's happening, or what's going on. Billy passes in between these reporters, but can never really be part of that group, partly because he's othered by being Asian, by being a dwarf, but also probably mainly because he can't disconnect like they can. He has more of a stake in the conflict. Billy Kwan is in some ways very wise and in some ways very naive. He can't really switch it off. Seems like a bit of a child in some ways. Well, reminds me sometimes of sometimes children are very particular about following the rules. They might become very anxious about following a certain rule that an adult would perhaps have the perspective to see is unimportant. So at times he seems very clingy, but on the other hand, he's one of the few people who seems to be in touch with the moral fundamentals of the situation. Every Peter Weir film that I've seen is nuanced, and this one is no different. Like I said, it might be a bit hard to latch onto at first, a bit hard to figure out who everyone is. But nonetheless, the beginning of this film is subtly poignant. And like I said, the Linda Hunt thing, it's a distraction for me. It takes something from the movie, but there are a lot of other elements that can fill in the gaps. And before too long, the heat of the film really gets turned up as well. But let's take a minor detour to talk about the style. This movie came out in 1982, but it doesn't look like it's from the 80s. The movie is set in the 60s, but it has kind of a 70s flavor to it, besides one song by Vangelis, which you hear a few times. I think Vangelis passed away recently. This is going to sound a little bit weird, but Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver don't quite look like themselves in this movie, as in not their iconic selves, not their kind of 1980s selves. It might just be that they're younger. Sometimes having huge stars in a movie like this can really spoil the historical effect, but here they get away with it. I should mention, by the way, if you guys are at all interested in political dramas, especially this sort of international politics, there is one director who reigns absolutely supreme in this genre, and it's Costa Gavras, who directed movies like Z or Special Section. Incredible director. This movie reminds me a little bit of some of his films. One observation about the style that's a little bit more concrete is that there are not very many wide shots in this film. The framing of the movie is a little bit weird, a little bit tighter than you would expect, or there's some shots where we just sort of alternate between close-ups of different people's faces, with no establishing shots, really. This is probably because only half of the film was actually shot on location. The first half of the movie was filmed in Manila, not quite on location, but which Manila stood in for Jakarta. There was apparently a lot of local blowback, protests, and death threats. There were a number of different accounts about why this was or how serious it was. You can look it up. It's somewhat interesting. But one way or the other, the production ended up pulling out and finishing up in Australia. By the way, a lot of the actors in this film are Filipino, and there's even Filipino spoken in the movie, apparently. Set pieces aren't really the highlight of the film. In a lot of sort of historical dramas, set pieces are a big deal, but this movie doesn't feature them. Interestingly, the tension and the uncertainty that surrounded the production are pretty similar to some of the events that go on in the film. Maybe it kind of feeds the narrative to some extent. Maybe it helped the production perhaps subconsciously capture what this time was like. You don't really need to know anything about Indonesia to understand this movie. In 1965, the country was led by Sukarno, a president with only one name, who took office, I think, in 1945. He'd been there for a while. And speaking of disconnects, he doesn't seem very kind to the residents, doesn't seem in tune with them. But there are a number of factions in the country, a lot of different alternative leadership strategies, and it's not clear what's going to happen. Hence all the reporters. As the movie goes on, the tension gets ramped up. At the beginning of the film, Guy can't seem to get an interview. Doesn't know the people to talk to. Nobody wants to talk to him. Can't find any stories to report. Before long, he has the opposite problem. When Guy first visits the palace, he has to take off his glasses. Apparently, the guards think that they can spot an assassin by looking into his eyes. As total insurrection becomes a bigger and bigger possibility, and it seems more and more likely that people are going to be protesting on the streets, that there'll be huge crowds busting down the fences of the palace, it seems rather quaint to worry about a lone assassin. As political tensions increase, things get a bit more complicated for our characters. Trust is harder to come by. You start to wonder if people are really who they seem, where everyone's allegiances lie, why people are helping each other out. This movie turns up the heat, and it does this very well. Like I said, you wonder about this question, uncertainty, if this was informed in part by the experiences producing the movie. While this is going on, we are introduced to the film's romantic plotline. Romance is a big part of this movie. If you look at some of the marketing, this is marketed to some extent as a romantic film, and that's possibly because Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver were relatively well-known actors, and so they want to foreground that. romance is only part of this movie, and it isn't introduced for a long time. That said, the romantic plot line is extremely strong in this movie. Phenomenal part of the movie, and so it's not too surprising that it's part of what's talked about here. Like I said, it takes a long time. You might not even... I didn't even really realize that Sigourney Weaver was in the movie at first. But she shows up. It's not clear that they're headed towards each other, but eventually and very naturally, Jilly, her character, and Guy come together. Partly, I think, the dynamo of this is that the characters are both very charismatic. But there's a lot more to it than that. Subtlety, uncertainty, patience. This is just a textbook about how to have a good romantic plotline in a film. Now, there are some things. So you're probably getting the sense already that I think I enjoyed watching this movie. The beginning, a little bit difficult to latch onto, maybe, but as tensions increase, the movie gets really, really good. As you get into this romantic plot line, the movie gets really, really good. It still has subtlety, still a lot of interesting ideas and themes about what it means to be a reporter on the ground there, what it means to connect with this place, what it means to make sense of it, the things that we miss when we try to do that, the things we overlook accidentally or on purpose. This movie gets very strong. There are a couple of things in the later portions that are a little bit weird, though. For one thing, there's a couple of plot lines in particular that kind of come to the center. And when the tension increases, that's really driven by a couple of things in particular. I'm not going to get into what they are. It seems like this is going to sort of take over the whole movie. Like these big conflicts are going to come to the forefront, but they don't quite. And to some extent, it seems like just when things are really heating up, just when the movie is really gets going, there is a detour. Things go the other way. I was a little bit confused at one point, a little bit disappointed that it didn't lean more into a particular conflict. But I think what's really going on here is that this is a movie about a lot of different things, a lot of different themes that shows us many different facets of the circumstances. And so while a couple of these become very, very tense, there's still other things to see and do. But like I said, the pacing is maybe a little bit wonky at some points. That said, very strong movie. Gives you a hair-raising finish. And like a lot of Peter Weir's films, this is a movie that kind of has it all. Peter Weir has made a bunch of different movies. We've reviewed on this channel. This is the third one. We saw Master and Commander. We saw Picnic at Hanging Rock. Those are two radically different movies. Now, all of these were historical dramas, so maybe they have that in common. Of course, if you throw The Truman Show in there, then we've really confused things. The thing that all of these have in common, though, is being a total package, I think. A movie that is engaging, gripping, but that has a lot of nuance. This movie's no different. Finally, this movie also has one of my favorite things, which is uncertainty. I mean, I've alluded to it already, how there's disconnects, how it's a weird place. There's real uncertainty. Another piece about this is, I was saying earlier that in some ways the characters seem a little bit undefined. Mel Gibson often kind of plays the hero, he kind of plays the guy who's maybe not going to take no for an answer, will play a very sort of strong-minded individual or something like that. In this movie, he's confident, but he's also uncertain. He makes mistakes, he takes missteps, realizes his mistakes sometimes, and is uncertain other times. And that's a big check mark for me. This movie, like basically all the movies I like, foregrounds uncertainty throughout, even as you enter the romantic plot line. There's a lot of uncertainty there. Most romantic films sort of take it for granted that obviously the thing that needs to happen is that the couple needs to get together. This movie doesn't. Even as we get to sort of the hair-raising finale, there's still a lot of uncertainty about the country, and there's a deep sense. It's interesting. The movie itself is not exactly zooms in on the plight of the people living there. There's another question about the movie is like, it's a little bit weird that we go all the way to Indonesia to make this movie, seemingly about a revolution, but it's kind of also a romance focused on these two white people there. And, that's just another reason why I thought maybe the movie would be a little bit of a mess. But I think ultimately that actually kind of ends up being a strength because it tells the story again of disconnection and of this weird convergence of the worlds. The movie itself reflects that in its form, But it is fair to say that this is not a rigorous analysis necessarily of the situation on the ground, or it's not a rigorous historical account. That said, it does leave you with a poignant sense of the conditions and the political struggles and setbacks in Indonesia. This is an eclectic movie. At times maybe a bit over the top. Some of the characters are extreme, like Billy Kwan, some of the other ones. There's one of the other reporters. I forget which actor this is, but it's sort of a discount James Woods, plays a reporter who's really not very nice. Some of the characters are kind of extreme, almost cartoonish, but there's also, heavy-handed lines. Some of the stuff that Billy Kwan says is, a little bit hyper-philosophical or something. Nonetheless, this movie really does come together to tell a complex story, but also to tell an engaging story. Now, without a doubt, the weird casting complicates the legacy of The Year of Living Dangerously. Like I said, I can understand if that's a deal breaker or if it sours the film for you or distracts you. Distracted me, definitely. I don't think Billy Kwan holds up exactly. But nonetheless, I can confidently say that this is a great movie. And our search for a bad Peter Weir film goes on. That said, I will shortly be watching The Cars That Ate Paris, and that may finally be the answer. But for now, that's The Year of Living Dangerously. Quirky movie, but I would recommend it.